My guest this week is Camilla Aisa. Camilla Aisa went from being a stuffy teenager complaining that music wasn't what it used to be in the 60s to listening to some 150 new records every year. After being awarded a master's degree from London South Bank University with a dissertation on underground music from the Pacific Northwest, she realized that what she wanted to do was turn others onto the sounds she loved, and that the one thing she could do was scribble something about it. She's a freelance scribe writing for Shindig, Record Collector, and the occasional academic paper, and works for the cult indie label Independent Project Records as an in-house writer, publicist, and social media manager. She also manages socials for artists Dengue Fever, Music Docs, Louder Than You Think, A Lo-Fi History of Gary Young and Pavement, and various others. She generally likes cats and dogs better than people, plays bass, and watches too many movies and TV series. And it is my pleasure to welcome to Revolutions Per Movie, Camilla Aisa. Hi.
Hello.
How are you doing over there?
All good, thank you. And I confirmed that I watch too many movies, and this is why we're here.
Yes, I don't know if you knew, but I owned a video store for 22 years. And so I miss talking about movies too. I was like a video bartender, and I was one of the kind of people that I'd like to work and be out front and talk to people rather than hiding back and just do paperwork. So this has been amazing. And I'm really excited to talk to you about the film Sisters With Transitors that you picked, the 2020 film by Lisa Rovner. But before that, I want to talk to you about your dissertation in Pacific Northwest music, being from Portland, Oregon, and, you know, growing up with that type of music, you know, whether it was the Wipers or Mudhoney, or what drew you to it? What was this paper about?
Well, I think, first of all, at the time, I was still, very much of a 60s and 70s person who didn't pay that much attention to, stuff that had been released after, I guess, 79. And one notable exception would be 90s music for me. I mean, the Riot Girl scene, lots of stuff from the 90s. So I was trying so hard to put together 60s and 90s because I felt like there was an affinity there somewhere. And I was fascinated by, Pacific Northwest scene because I thought it had a very distinctive sound, which was, distinctive both in the 60s and in the 90s. And I thought that the two things had sort of a kindred spirit, although many 90s bands were just sort of refusing the past in their own way.
Right.
I thought, something like the Sonics did sound pre-grungy, or, the Northwest punk rock sound was somewhere already in those bands. So, I was trying to put the two countercultures together and see whether, the place where you create music might have any influence on the music you make. And it turns out that, it probably did in that case.
And the type of garage and psychedelia that was coming out of England in the late 80s or 90s was, right. Do you feel like that was pretty stylistically different than what was coming out of the Pacific Northwest?
Yeah, I think it was different, especially if you look at 60s stuff. 60s psych or garage from the Northwest is far more, gloomy and less optimistic, less flower power than the stuff we're used to that was coming out of the West Coast, England, the classic psychedelic sound. It's far more pessimistic in a way and murky. And I think that in that way, it was sort of ahead of its time, perhaps, which, it sort of predates a lot of late 80s and 90s music that would come out of not only the Pacific Northwest, but the US in general. So in that, I think it was definitely ahead of its time.
Are there any bands that specifically resonated with you that you discovered while doing this that you just can't live without now?
Oh, I don't think that I, made new discoveries that maybe, just delving into offshoots and like the Riot Girls band, I was familiar with the, bigger names, and finding something like the Frumpies, which was sort of surf rock updated in a 90s angry way, was super fun. And yeah, I also have to mention that one of the reasons why I looked into the Pacific Northwest is that I wasn't listening to a lot of current music back then, which was way different than what I'm doing now. And one notable exception for me was Slater Kinney, which was absolutely and still is one of my all-time favorite bands. And, I did find a slight psychedelic element to those records. And that was, it's definitely not what's brought up every time somebody writes about them. So, it was my way of connecting different things that I liked and, wondering why I like them at the same time. So, yeah, I think that I delve that gave me an occasion to delve deeper into 90s music, especially being a 60s obsessed person.
It's a good era to be obsessed in. It goes on and on and on. I just always feel like I'm still being turned on to things I've never heard about, private press runs and weird little scenes. Because a lot of those bands, were around for a very short period of time and imploded, but they did record. It's kind of an amazing period to obsess about.
Yeah, and you get so many records that never came out, and now that we're all obsessed with obscurities and
Yeah.
private press jewels and finding stuff that nobody has ever listened to before. We're finally getting a chance to discover them and make them great.
Yeah, and speaking of, weirdos making music, I'm really excited about the Gary Young documentary
Right.
that you're also helping with, and obviously very sad his passing recently. Do you have any news on when that might be released or where it's at?
Well, it's still doing its festival run. So we have some dates for European festivals, and some have already been announced, and somebody will soon. And after that, it's then that you can look into streaming and things
Okay.
like that. But it's it won an audience award at South by Southwest, and it did very well at a few other film festivals and screenings. And I really look forward to people seeing it, more and more people, because thankfully Gary got to see it, and
Oh,
he was
great.
actually present at the South by Southwest premiere. So, he was there handing out fruit as he did in the good old days. And so he got this really, I was sort of brought to tears seeing those pictures of him, was very frail a few months ago already. And so to see him, talking to fans that, went there to see a movie about his life, it's really sweet. And I'm so happy that, I was involved and that he got to see it finished.
He was my gateway to finding about Pavement. I just saw a photo of some guy doing a handstand on
Yeah.
stage, and I was like, I want to see that. And then by the time Pavement came to Portland, he was already not in it. but I just was kind of obsessed by the mythology of, somebody who was a little older and kind of seemed to be having like a show within a show. And I'm really excited for the movie.
Yeah. And, I look forward to hearing what you'll think of it.
I'm sure somebody will pick it to talk about.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about Sisters with Transistors. This was a really interesting film because I know it was about female pioneers in electronic music, but I think there was a part of me that expected it to have a lot more emphasis maybe on synthesizers and pop or rock movements, or even Laurie Anderson, who narrates the film, is not a person that they focus on. It is wildly experimental and improvisational. Were you familiar with many of the artists in this film before seeing this?
Yes. I mean, I was already a big fan, especially of people like Suzanne Ciani.
Yes.
And, of course, I was actually about to, I think that when I got the promo to see the documentary, which was about to debut at some festival, I was preparing a long piece on Suzanne. So we were talking at the time, and we did the long interview after I saw it, and it was nice to tie it up together. And of course, Delia Derbyshire is, if you like weird music and you're based in the UK, she's sort of unescapable. And, I was familiar with, I think, each of them, but I did love the way the movie brought them together, because it wasn't easy, I can imagine, because they were doing such different things. And, the movie spans decades. And you start from Clara Rockmore, who was pioneering the theremin, and she's, very much tied to an old-fashioned conception of classical music, and then she ventures into this, absolutely weird thing that nobody else got. And so, she seems to be a tie to different centuries altogether. And it's lovely to hear you have voiceovers and little contributions from contemporary musicians. So it's, it was the music of the future for a reason. So it's what is being discussed in the movie is sort of out of time more than of a particular time.
Yeah, it seems like a mantra in the film is, why do we want to stay within this white, dead male composition world of tradition? Is very critical of Switched on Bach.
Yeah, I think the Switched on Bach is being called something of a, it is a pioneering moment, because it's the mainstream audience's first encounter with a synthesizer, probably. But at the same time, it was sort of perceived as a setback from people who were already experimenting with these instruments, because it sort of created an expectation from people, the general public, from electronic instruments to try to behave like classic, old-fashioned instruments. So, that music was trying to emulate something that already existed, whereas, what the other composers were doing was, you can safely say the opposite, create new words altogether. And so, when I talk about Wendy Carlos, I like to focus more on like the Shining soundtrack, or, other stuff that didn't have that sort of heavy legacy of all the switched on albums, because there's a lot of them from all sorts of different male musicians, like Switched on Country, Switched on the Beatles, which I absolutely love as novelty. objects, but they definitely don't have the same depth of what was being explored through modular instruments at around the same time.
Before we get into the composers that are focused on this movie, I wanted to talk about is it the Buchla synthesizer?
Buchla.
Buchla.
Yeah.
As a synthesizer nerd of the 80s who wanted a keytar like Devo had and loved, Tuxedo Moon and the Residents, I had never heard of this synthesizer till this movie, and I felt very naive. But it seemed that almost everyone in this film, or the majority, were using this modular system. Do you know much about the history of that, or why that came to be versus like a Moog or Moog? Can you settle the debate for me?
I cannot. I've always said Moog, but yeah.
Yeah, me too. I switch back and forth because I think I get nervous about it. Do you know why there was a preference for this type of synthesizer?
Well, I actually had a really nice occasion to discuss this with Suzanne Ciani when we did our interview. And, it was sort of Beatles versus Rolling Stones. They would be big fans of one and sort of publicly not like things about the other. It was a very partisan situation in some cases. But at the core of it, it's two different visions of what a synthesizer could be. And the Moog is more likely to replicate the situation that you find yourself in with a keyboard. The Buchla is more keen on abstraction, I would say. You don't have a keyboard. So I think that for these composers, which, as you said, were very avant-garde, very experimental, very interested in absolute abstraction in certain cases, the Buchla was more of a completely new thing that would allow them to discover completely new territory. Whereas with the Moog, you would still be sort of tied to normal ways of playing music, although, of course, it also totally new. Yeah, it is interesting to notice that these particular people were more often in love with the Buchla than the Moog. And if you look at it from a pop music perspective, it's sort of the opposite, because musicians at the time were trying out synthesizers. When they came out, they were more likely to experiment with Moogs. Because again, I as somebody who has no practical experience of synthesizers, I can imagine that it'd be more accessible, a little bit easier to try out than a Buchla if you have previous experience with keyboards or traditional instruments. So I think that's what is at the core of the discussion.
Yeah, even watching Suzanne play the Buchla, the person who put this together, Don Buchla, was like, well, why would I want a traditional keyboard if I'm making this very untraditional thing? And so he created something called Thunder and something called Lightning. And just watching them play this science fiction looking pad with like interesting bird wing looking things on it and little diamonds, it was fascinating.
Now, I think that for a musician is way more of a tactile experience, which ties in with what Suzanne says in the movie, which is that she finds the synthesizer and electronic music to be central. I think that having the more tactile, experience with it, with an instrument, your body is more connected to it. And the music depends more on your touch and the way you approach the instrument physically. I think that's also part of the fascination and the new possibilities that it opened. And I remember that as Buchla was building his instrument, Suzanne would be at the time instrumental in him developing certain things, because she sort of became, the main player of his instrument. So, it's interesting to see how it wasn't just a totally new creation, but it also followed the experience of players who were out there in the world making these experiments.
After the film, I tracked down a 2020 live performance she was doing called Sonic Womb, and it's just all improvisations with the Buchla still. Yeah. It was pretty amazing. She basically described it as an improvisation that I began using in the 70s and continue to use now as raw material, with each performance having its own expression. And she said one could liken it to jazz. And it was amazing. Suzanne's story, who bookends the film, is incredible, because she couldn't get a record deal, and she went to work in advertising, and almost everything that they showed, I remember, is just in my DNA. Stuff for Coke and Atari and Cadillac, and she did the music and the voice effects on that pinball Xenon, which was such an amazing. It was to me, blew my mind when I was a kid.
The GE washing machine as well. The advertising really presents it as this sort of, ultra modern object that sort of looks like it comes from space. And it's, it's just like pure futurism. And she did sounds for that as well. And the Coke one, I think, I don't know, how many seconds is that? 2, maybe? I think that's one of the most perfect pieces of music that ever existed. Because it's everything. It's real. It is the experience of drinking Coke. And at the same time, it has this fantasy element to it. It's almost psychedelic. And I love that. And it's 2 seconds of sounds.
They're so iconic, and they were experimental. They're showing a series of them in a row, and they sound like nothing else. And they are very adventurous and very strange and very untraditional. And it was just accepted in the advertising world at that point, where it wasn't accepted for her as a recording artist. And she was hired by Lily Tomlin to compose for the incredible Shrinking Woman, the first woman to score a major motion picture film.
Yeah, which is crazy when you plays it. It was the second half of the 80s.
Yeah.
So, mind-blowing in the wrong way.
And she says that then it took another 14 years before another woman was hired for that role.
Right.
She talks about there were no role models for female composers when she studied music, and how it was basically kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Yeah, I think that the first thing I probably noticed was that she was as enthusiastic about, making music the way that she does, as she was in that famous Letterman interview, where she was.
That's great.
In the late 20s. So she's still making music with Buchla. I think that there was a period of time, maybe a couple of decades, where she had been using different instruments, and then she more or less recently went back to the Buchla, and this love story happened all over again. And she's now playing, you just saw a video, she's now playing again with the Buchla, and also collaborating with young artists who are, making new discoveries through the same modular instruments, because that's another interesting aspect, this resurgence of modular electronic instruments. And I like that you brought together that the advertising that she had to go through to really make a career out of playing electronic music. And the Doctor Who example, which was, came much sooner and in another place in the UK, but it is at the core the same thing. People, the general public, had to become acquainted with these weird alien sounds. So in the UK, it was television. It was, watching the same TV series every week. And, in the US, it was advertising. So it had to be something very, almost a daily encounter that was enforced. And, it did work because, now we listen to these things and it's, they don't sound that alien anymore. Although I would say that the Doctor Who theme is still one of probably the scariest pieces of music I've heard. And it still works its magic. And I've never seen an episode of Doctor Who, but I'm still fascinated.
Wow.
And, yeah, I'll admit that. And I think that when you see, pieces of science fiction from that time, now they've aged, maybe not that well. That you can definitely tell it's because of the special effects, because of the, people being a bit more naive, I guess. It's different, and you can place them in the decades they were made. And when it comes to this music, it's still scary. It still works. It still conjures, views of space, of the moon, of, alien encounters. So I would say that the music has aged far better than the things it was made for.
A perfect example is B.B. Barron's work on Forbidden Planet, a very corny but beloved science fiction film. Her and her partner Louis, they were like bohemians, and they had one of the few setups to record in the village, and all sorts of experimental filmmakers, Shirley Clark, dancers, poets would come over and utilize this this equipment in such an experimental way. And they were hired to do the first electronic score for a feature film, Forbidden Planet. The music in it is so incredible still. The sound of the monster dying is the actual sound of the circuits frying out, and it is really disturbing and gets under your skin to hear something cry and kind of to hear a machine cry in pain,
Yeah,
and kind of die. It's really amazingly effective.
absolutely. And the sad fact about that is that they weren't credited as composers of the soundtrack. I don't remember the exact words, but it was like electronic effects by
Electronic tonalities.
tonalities, right?
Yeah.
And which is totally what was happening also with the, when the BBC workshop was established to produce electronic music. They sort of had to create an entirely new department for that within the BBC, because it was an incredibly long dispute between, the radio drama department, which was what, these electronic pieces were originally invented for. They just had to be background noises to accompany drama. And the music department, which absolutely did not want anything to do with these instruments that they refused to call instruments. And it was all a big question of unions fighting over what was music and what was not. And, this fright of, machines taking over and taking jobs from musicians. And which is, again, relevant.
Laurie Spiegel, who's featured in the film, at Bell Labs, she was just making these computers where she would using punch cards to create music.
Mhm.
And one of the quotes she said was, "The machine doesn't write the music." But it seems like there's a lot of fear from musicians too, just being afraid of the machine writing the music now, with AI and stuff. And some people are running towards it, and other people are pushing against it.
Yeah, and I think it will also be interesting to see where this takes human creativity, because again, in that case, the machines could do a lot of things um, that musicians, humans were used to doing, but that was just an occasion to develop more creativity and run wild with something new and create new sonic worlds. So I'm interested in seeing what this AI thing will bring out of us now. Because again, like you, I don't believe that the machines write their own music. You have to make them do something. So
Yeah, a machine is not going to come up with something that Marianne Mache would do. A machine it's going to take a while before a machine is going to want to make a house levitate through physical sound created by electronic noise. That was a really amazing sequence where Marianne is performing in her house, and Thurston Moore is
nice.
cowering in the corner with his hands over his ears. He looks such a little kid, like nervous about maybe
Yeah.
permanent damage to his ears or something. And Marianne is just like rocking out. She was really interested in creating, autoacoustic emissions, which are like frequencies, two different frequencies in the ear, and your mind trying to resolve the two of them to create a third piece called ear tones. What is the most physical musical experience you've ever had, either live or on record?
That's a really good question. Um, well, it depends because uh, I've had times where just I would just respond to loudness, being present, something loud, something so enveloping that you can't stop your entire body to respond to it. But sometimes it can be small things that are very emotional. Just even a pop song that comes out at the right moment, and something about, not talking about lyrics, but something about a guitar tone that resonates with you. I have this song that the Breeders, my favorite band, released in uh, 2018, the latest record. It's called Dawn Making an Effort. And my favorite thing about it, it's just the sound of the guitar. It has this beautiful effect on it. And when I first heard it, it was a really dark time. And, I was very pessimistic about a lot of things, but I would say everything. And just hearing that guitar tone told my entire brain and soul that, if things this beautiful, this simply beautiful, can come out at any times, that was a new album just released, and it was my first time hearing it, then it's worth making an effort, as the song, said. And so, yeah, I guess that I don't recommend people, I've never recommended people to sit down and listen to the songs that will happen to you, because that's very personal. For other people, it will be just a guitar part in a song, in a pretty song. But for me, at that time, at that moment, it was the right thing. And maybe if it had come out a year later, it would have been different and not so seismic, so to speak. So, but I would be very interested in, being present during a concert, although I'd like to call them more like happenings. of one of these performers. Most of them have obviously passed away because, the protagonists of Sisters with Transistors. But it would be great to travel back in time and be there, because it's, as you said, it was a very in the moment experience in some cases. And the beauty of this experimental electronic music is that, you likely won't be able to reproduce the same thing twice. So, it is a unique event, a one of a kind moment. And, being involved in it, being there, it's definitely like, playing your little part in the performance and co-create with the music as you resonate with it.
On the other hand, you have Aline Redig, who she's on a search to get the sounds out of her head. They show her at the end of the film hearing musicians play her music back to her. And she says, there were days I thought I was crazy. And for the first time, I'm hearing the music as I imagined hearing it. And it's a very emotional, powerful segment of her just having a complete physical and emotional reaction to hearing what she thought was possible kind of come back to her as a composer and as a participant and as the inspiration. A lot of the people that are featured in this film, the way they hear sounds is very unique. You have people who can say, oh, the sound of New York City is an E flat, and the sound of Boston Harbor is an F. And Delia talking about the sounds of air raid sirens and during the Blitz, and just how powerful and informative and exciting that was to inform her. It's such an interesting documentation, this film, on how different people listen. Because even though a lot of these people are using the same kind of instruments to make this, they're all making wildly different types of compositions.
Yeah, I think that's another result of having a machine that was yet fairly unexplored. That each person would approach it in a different way. And again, it's not the kind of instrument that you can use to recreate the same thing twice. So personality plays a big role in it. And the fact that it connects so well with one's inner self, makes for, such a wide-ranging expression, potential of expression. And that is definitely what you hear if you listen to these composers, who, again, it's interesting to watch a movie where they're connected so well, and at the same time to realize how different they are from each other, how different the music is. You cannot hear, their various pieces and, get the author wrong, because it's so, so unmistakable with their approach.
I thought Laurie's thing was really interesting. In high school, she wanted to be a musician and talked to a school counselor about it. And they basically said, you can't. You haven't had any years of training. You can never do that. She just basically was like, I got to do this or I'll regret it. But also talked about how at the time when she was wanting to bring computers into it, computers were kind of looked at as, the enemy of the counterculture, because computers were, non-human and would take those elements out of it.
Yeah, I think that's the thing with electronic music of this kind, that, from the outside, it definitely looks like an industry-like practice. It has this, computers was synonym with offices, of course. And, that's the appearance. And I think that's the reason why, as a 16-year-old who was in love with guitar rock, I was definitely not considering electronic music worthy of any investigation. I would talk of listening to real instruments, which I would definitely, once I get to go back in time, I will also visit my 16-year-old self and kick myself. But I was in love with guitars, and my favorite thing has always been psychedelic rock. And actually, my epiphany came with the realization that maybe electronic music, this kind of electronic music, was the most psychedelic thing of all, because it's in the etymological sense of the word, it's the most, I don't know, the realist expression of the soul you can hope for. It isn't tied to scales. It isn't tied to any sort of dogma. It's just pure expression. And so, yeah, it pure expression of the soul. So, and it's free and it's uncharted territory, especially at the time. And so, yeah, I think that the moment I realized that, I was okay with listening to it, and I found this whole world of magnificent sounds, and it's now, one of my favorite things.
Yeah, well, when you're 16, you're supposed to have some guarded decisions about, oh, that seems pretentious, or that's not real, or that's, a sellout.
Yeah, and in some cases I wasn't ready for it, so I didn't try. And some others, I wasn't ready for them, so I listened to them and I didn't get them. And I remember at one point I decided that I wanted to listen to everything the Beatles had done, because I knew a few songs, everybody does, and I wanted, they were the biggest band in the world, so I wanted to know everything about them. And I started from, I think I Googled them and saw that Sgt. Pepper was the most famous thing, that, the most celebrated of all the albums. So I tried with that, and I was so disappointed because it absolutely didn't do anything for me, which is crazy to realize in retrospect. But I went on and tried again with, I think the next one was White Album, and that was for me the moment. And it's sort of absurd, because I think that now that I know everything, all the albums very well, I can definitely tell that the White Album is more chaotic and difficult than Sgt. Pepper. But for some reason that resonated with me, and Sgt. Pepper didn't at the time. And so, yeah, I think that's, in the case of electronic music, I just thought, it wasn't for me. It wasn't what I like to call real instruments. So I didn't give it a try altogether. And I'm kind of glad that I didn't, because when I finally did years later, I had much more, I had tools to get it and to resonate with it and to appreciate more about it. So it's nice to revisit stuff. It's also nice to have stuff that you've never encountered, and to be able to have a meaningful first experience.
Many of my favorite records to this day are things that I didn't get on first listen. But I owned them and they stayed on the shelf. And when I was ready, I was ready for it. It's interesting you mentioned the Beatles. I feel like they get so much credit for, tape loops for Tomorrow Never Knows and Revolution 9. That they were the ones who started, often because in pop music, they were, very inventive and forward thinking. But you have someone like Daphne Oram, at the BBC, using tape loops all the time to create these amazing nightmare soundscapes for their radio plays. I guess after the war, a lot of the radio plays were very dark. They needed music to kind of match this new type of writing that was coming through. And I really loved her segment where they go to visit her and her talking about all the different things she does, because she was doing loops, she was doing, slowing things down, reversing them, painting graphic representations of sound and putting it into a machine. It was incredible. And then they play like something like Birds of Parallax, one of her compositions, and I'm sure there were many people who were breaking new ground back then. Yeah, I don't know. It's just interesting that there was so much going on, but because it was in the BBC radio department, it wasn't being treated with the same respect as traditional composers or pop musicians.
Yeah, and I would also say that, and the movie does make a great point for all of this. Its main characters aren't just important musically or culturally, but also on a technological level. People like Daphne or Laurie Spiegel were inventors. Oramix was Daphne Orum's invention, and Laurie Spiegel came up with this amazing software in the, I think it was the late 70s, called the mouse music, where you could play music with the newly invented Apple computer. And I can't help but say, if two men had come up with those things, we would be talking about them. And it was actually women. It was women who didn't have any possibility of getting a record deal because they weren't singing. And at the time, record labels would also, would just consider women who were singing. And so, it's one of the sad aspects of it. And yeah, I mean, pop music did play a big part in bringing, attention to these sounds. But, as you said, the BBC radio was already on, had been for years. Doctor Who was on every week. And so, yeah, of course, when it's somebody like the Beatles who embrace something, it does get a wider audience and more respectability, I guess. And I know that I think it was the first version of the Moog that was brought to, they sort of had a little stand at Monterey Pop.
Oh.
And the two people who were there to explain stuff were Beaver and Krause, who later produced some really cool electronic music records. And once they got people's attention there, they were, soon visiting different pop acts. I think they talked to the Byrds. I know that they did something with the Doors. And, they were literally, teaching people how to use a Moog. And these pop stars, they were so eager to start making music with the Moog that they wouldn't, these first very famous examples of Moogs being introduced in pop songs, the Beach Boys, for example, they were immediately wildly discarded by actual players of electronic instruments because they were like goofy attempts. And George Harrison did a soundtrack, an electronic music soundtrack for Apple. Yes. And people who at the time were already turned on to electronic music sort of hated it. Because it's like, I guess the same goes for Revolution 9. You can't take somebody who devotes their life to music concrete, for example, and show them that and people who really know avant-garde and tell them that this is a turning point in musical is history for that genre and that style. But it's the same thing we were mentioning about Switch on Bach. You sort of have to embrace it because it brought familiarity between the instrument, the new sound, and the wide public, so that it wouldn't be considered to be just crazy anymore, crazy stuff that had no place in music. But yeah, at the same time, you have to know your history, and movies like this are absolutely welcome because they allow a lot of people to be educated about unsung heroes who did great things.
Was there anyone that you felt was potentially overlooked in this film that you were surprised wasn't featured in the film?
Well, I was actually surprised because some of the people who are featured are, lesser known figures. So it's nice to have that wide of a overview. This is one movie, and there was not space for everybody, every pioneering woman there ever was. And I'm always very disappointed and think that movies are a bit too long with a lot of them, like 80% of the time. I think this movie says the right things, and at the same time, it leaves you with this need to investigate further, which is great. I think that, when you finish watching a movie and you go straight to Google or Spotify or whatever, that's a good sign.
I feel like I knew you through your writings. I love hearing you talk about music, and I just look forward to every Shindig issue that comes out and seeing what I'm going to learn from you, because most of it I haven't heard of. So I just while you're here, I wanted to thank you for that, because as a music fan, still trying to find things to love, I just wanted to say I appreciate that. So
thank you. It's really means a lot.
So at the end of every episode, I ask the same question, but I tailor it depending on the film. So on a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 being the lowest and 10 being the highest, how many autoacoustic emissions or ear tones would you give this film?
I would say 9.
That is an amazing answer. It might even be a 10 for me. I just keep talking about this film. I'm so glad you picked it.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I gave you some titles and I was totally undecided because I think we're so many of them that could make for interesting conversations. But this is an overlooked gem, and it's good to, talk about it and bring it to people's attention.
Well, thank you so much. It was so good to see you, and I will talk to you soon.
Perfect. Thank you again.
Thank you again. Bye. Thank you for listening to Revolutions Per Movie. We release new episodes every Thursday, so be sure to search for the show on your favorite podcast app and subscribe to the show. And if you've enjoyed this, it would mean a lot to me if you would rate and review it as well. You can follow us on social media at Revolutions Per Movie, and also find out more information about our various guests in the episode show notes. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week. Bye!